All right, let's go. Number 10. The Marine who let his enemy go. On April 7th, 1943, the largest Japanese air raid on Guadalcanal of the entire Pacific campaign filled the sky above the Solomon Islands with more than 160 enemy aircraft. Marine Corps pilot First Lieutenant James Swett climbed to meet them in his Grumman F4F Wildcat, part of VMF 221, and in a single extraordinary sortie shot down 7 Japanese aircraft, a feat that would earn him the Medal of Honor. But what the citation doesn't record is what happened in the moments between kills. Swett was flying in a theater where mercy was a foreign concept. The Pacific War had calcified into something brutal and reciprocal, where the rules of chivalrous combat that still flickered in the European skies had largely been extinguished by the ferocity of both sides. Pilots on both sides knew what awaited a man who showed hesitation in the wrong moment. In the chaos of that April morning, Swett came upon a Japanese pilot who had already given up. The man was done. Whatever the precise details of that encounter, and accounts passed through the fog of combat, Swett made the choice that cost him nothing militarily and revealed something essential about his character. He banked away. Later that same day, Swett's own aircraft was shot up badly enough that he was forced to ditch in the waters around Guadalcanal. He was pulled from the sea, wounded by a crash boat crew. He had spent his morning being lethal beyond almost any measure in the Pacific War. He had also, in one quiet moment, chosen otherwise. Admiral Chester Nimitz presented Swett with the Medal of Honor on August 7, 1943. The medal recognized what he destroyed. It said nothing about what he chose not to. Number 9. The Star of Africa's Unwritten Rule. By the autumn of 1942, Oberleutnant Hans Joachim Marseille had become the most lethal fighter pilot the Luftwaffe had ever deployed over North Africa. His 158 confirmed aerial victories, all of them against Western Allied aircraft, were accumulated in just over 2 years of combat with Jagdgeschwader 27. The Luftwaffe called him Der Stern von Afrika, the Star of Africa. The men who flew against him called him something they couldn't quite explain. Marseille's kill rate was extraordinary, even by the standards of an air force that produced some of the highest scoring aces in aviation history. He flew with an instinctive, almost improvisational aggression, attacking from angles and positions that defied conventional textbook doctrine. His wingmen struggled to keep up. His superiors struggled to understand him. But pilots on both sides of the conflict noticed something consistent about Marseille that had nothing to do with his ferocity. He never fired on a parachute. Not once, across 158 victories and hundreds of combat sorties, did he fire on a man who had already left his aircraft. This was not Luftwaffe policy. It was Marseille's policy, self-imposed and held to absolutely in an air campaign that had no shortage of brutality on the ground below him. His wingman Rainer Pöttgen and others who flew alongside him attested to this behavior in post-war accounts. Marseille's reasoning, as pieced together from those accounts, was simple. A pilot in a parachute is no longer a combatant. The fight is over for that man. Engaging him is not war. Marseille died on September 30th, 1942, aged 22, when the engine of his new Bf-109G caught fire and he struck the tail section bailing out at low altitude. He never reached space to fully explain himself. What does it tell us about a man that the rules he refused to break were the ones no one had ever written down? Number 8. The pilot who shot down his own side to save them. On February 10th, 1945, First Lieutenant Louis E. Kurds of the 4th Fighter Squadron, 3rd Air Commando Group, was flying his P-51 Mustang on patrol near Bataan Island in the Philippines when he spotted an aircraft making its final approach to the island's airstrip. The approach was steady, practiced, unhurried. It was also going to end in catastrophe because Bataan Island's airstrip was under Japanese control. The aircraft was a C-47 transport. American-built and American-crewed, carrying passengers that included a group of nurses and servicemen. Their radio had failed. They had no idea where they were landing. To the crew and passengers of that C-47, the runway ahead looked like salvation. To Kurds, watching from above in his Mustang, it looked like a sentence. He fired warning shots. The C-47 did not respond. The approach continued. Kurds made a decision that no rule of engagement had ever anticipated, and that would be difficult to explain to anyone who wasn't watching from his cockpit. He fired on the C-47's engines, deliberately, precisely, until both failed and the aircraft was forced to ditch in the sea off the island's coast. Everyone aboard survived the ditching. They were rescued from the water. Among the passengers was a nurse named Margaret Caldwell. She later married Louis Kurds. The United States military awarded Kurds the Air Medal for the action, one of the only medals in American military history ever presented for shooting down a friendly aircraft. Kurds had previously downed German, Italian, and Japanese planes. The C-47 completed the most unusual scorecard of the war. Some acts of mercy don't look like mercy at all until you count the survivors. Number 7. The Gentlemen of the Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, as the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force tore each other apart over southern England and the grey waters of the English Channel, Major Adolf Galland was accumulating one of the most formidable records in the Battle of Britain. Flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109E with Jagdgeschwader 26, the unit that would become known as the Abbeville Boys, Galland was building a reputation as one of the most skilled and aggressive pilots in the German air campaign. He was also quietly refusing to do something his superiors had never explicitly forbidden. Galland would not fire on parachuting pilots. This was not a written rule in the Luftwaffe code, and it was certainly not universal practice on either side of the channel. Pilots descending in parachutes over England could be back in a cockpit within hours. There was a cold military logic to finishing them. Galland rejected it. He documented his reasoning in his post-war memoir, Die Ersten und die Letzten, published in 1953. A pilot leaving his aircraft, in Galland's view, had ceased to be a combatant. The engagement was over. What happened next was no longer combat. He is also reported to have radioed the position of at least one downed RAF pilot to British Air-Sea Rescue Services, though accounts of how often he did this differ between sources. Galland ended the war with 104 confirmed aerial victories and the rank of General der Jagdflieger, the most senior fighter command position in the Luftwaffe. He survived to the age of 83, dying in February 1996. He clashed repeatedly with Hermann Göring and with the Luftwaffe High Command throughout the war, a pattern of principled defiance that went well beyond his conduct in the air. In a military apparatus built on obedience, Galland reserved the right to draw his own lines. In a war fought by machines and managed by ideology, what does it mean that one of its deadliest pilots chose to keep drawing them? Number 6. The Zero pilot who flew away. On August 7, 1942, Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service was flying his Mitsubishi A6M0 over Guadalcanal when he spotted what he believed to be a formation of American Grumman Wildcat fighters. Sakai was already one of the most experienced combat pilots in the Japanese Navy, with dozens of confirmed kills, and he moved into attack position with the methodical precision that had made him legendary among his own squadron. He closed to firing range. Then he looked more carefully. The aircraft were not Wildcats. They were TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and as Sakai realized his mistake, the gunners aboard them opened fire. A bullet shattered his skull above his right eye. The damage was catastrophic, blinding him in that eye and leaving him semi-conscious, barely able to hold his aircraft in the air. He flew 4 hours back to Rabaul in that condition, delirious and bleeding, and somehow survived. What is less frequently told is what Sakai documented in his 1957 memoir, Samurai, co-written with Martin Kaiden and Fred Saito. Across his career of 64 confirmed victories, Sakai described multiple occasions on which he chose not to fire. One account describes closing on a small liaison aircraft and seeing clearly through the windscreen that it posed no threat and carried what appeared to be non-combatants. He flew alongside it for a moment, then banked away. Sakai survived the war. He converted to pacifism after 1945, a transformation he described in interviews as neither sudden nor simple. He died on September 22, 2000, having outlived most of the men he had flown against, and several who had flown with him. Saburo Sakai spent his career being lethal with extraordinary precision. What he practiced with equal precision and far less fanfare was restraint. Number 5. The code of the highest scoring ace who ever lived. Erich Hartmann flew 404 combat missions for the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader, 52 on the Eastern Front. He was shot down or forced to crash land 16 separate times. He was captured by Soviet forces in May 1945 and held as a prisoner of war for 10.5 years, not released until October 1955. His 352 confirmed aerial victories remain the highest total of any fighter pilot in the history of aviation. Across every one of those missions, across every one of those years, he held to one rule without a single recorded exception. He would not fire on a man in a parachute. The Eastern Front was the most savage theater of the Second World War. The conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union was fought at a scale and with a ferocity that the Western campaigns rarely matched. Mercy between fighter pilots was neither expected nor common. Hartmann flew in this environment for years, racking up a kill count that no other pilot in history has approached, and he maintained his personal code through all of it. His biography, The Blonde Knight of Germany, written by Raymond F. Tolliver and Trevor J. Constable and published in 1970, documents his reasoning in detail. A pilot bailing out in Hartmann's framework was no longer part of the fight. Engaging him crossed a line that Hartmann placed clearly and held to absolutely, regardless of what the man in the parachute had been doing 30 seconds earlier. The Soviet pilots who flew against him gave him a fateful nickname, Der Schwarze Teufel, the Black Devil. They feared him as a combatant. He was, by their own accounts, one of the most dangerous men in the sky. What do we make of a man who was, by every measure, the most lethal fighter pilot who ever lived, and who never once fired on a man who couldn't fight back? Number 4. The last gesture over Germany. In April 1945, with the Third Reich in its final weeks of collapse and the war in Europe measurable in days rather than months, Free French pilot Pierre Klostermann was flying his Hawker Tempest MCO 5 with RAF No. 3 Squadron over northern Germany. Klostermann was by then one of the most decorated and experienced Allied fighter pilots still in the air, credited with aerial victories that made him the highest-scoring French ace of the entire war. He had been fighting since 1943. He was not a sentimental man. The war at that stage had taken on a strange, depleted quality. The Luftwaffe was still flying, but its pilots were often young, undertrained, and operating aircraft that had not seen proper maintenance in weeks. The gap in experience between a veteran like Klostermann and the men being sent up against him had become, in many engagements, almost grotesque. Klostermann described the encounter in his memoir, Le Grand Cirque, published in 1948 and translated into English as The Big Show, one of the most widely read fighter pilot accounts of the war. He had a Focke-Wulf FW-190 in his sights. The German pilot's maneuvers told him everything he needed to know. This was someone very new to this, flying a visibly neglected aircraft, doing everything wrong. Klostermann wrote that the pilot looked like a child. He pulled off the trigger. The German flew into cloud and disappeared. Klostermann never learned whether the pilot survived the war. He wrote about the moment with the careful, weathered honesty of a man who had made a decision he could explain, but not fully justify. Pierre Klosterman flew back to base that afternoon with an unused trigger and a question he could not answer. At what point does killing the enemy stop being war and start being something else entirely? Number 3. The enemy who saved him anyway. On June 26, 1943, Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, 61st Fighter Squadron, was returning from a bomber escort mission over occupied Europe in his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt when a Focke-Wulf FW-190 tore through his formation and left his aircraft in pieces. The hydraulics were gone. The cockpit was shattered, and he could not open the canopy to bail out. His guns were useless. Johnson was flying a wreck at altitude over enemy territory, and a German pilot had found him. What the German pilot did next has never been fully explained. He made 6 firing passes at Johnson's crippled Thunderbolt. Each pass produced little or no effective fire, as though his ammunition was exhausted, or his guns had jammed after the initial attack. Johnson, trapped inside his ruined cockpit, could do nothing but watch. On the final pass, the FW-190 pulled up alongside Johnson's aircraft, close enough that Johnson could see the German pilot's face clearly through the canopy. The German looked at him. He nodded, or he saluted. Johnson's account varies slightly on the gesture, and then he peeled away and flew back toward France. He did not return. Johnson nursed his shattered Thunderbolt back across the Channel and landed at Manston in England. Ground crews counted more than 200 bullet holes in the aircraft. Johnson went on to score 27 aerial victories, becoming one of the leading American aces in the European theater. He told the story in his 1958 memoir, Thunderbolt, co-written with Martin Caidin. The German pilot was never identified. Researchers have suggested he may have flown with JG-2, but no confirmation has ever emerged. Robert Johnson landed that day with more than 200 bullet holes in his aircraft, and one question he never answered. Why did a man who could have finished it choose, in the end, to leave him alive? Whatever that German pilot decided in those final seconds, it was the most consequential decision he ever made in the air, and history never learned his name. Number 2. The Escort. On December 20th, 1943, a Boeing B-17F bomber called Ye Old Pub, assigned to the 527th Bomb Squadron of the 379th Bomb Group, limped away from a raid on Bremen, Germany, in a condition that should not have kept it in the air. 3 of its 10 crew members were dead. 6 more were wounded. The nose of the aircraft had been largely destroyed by flak and fighter attack. Most of its defensive weapons were out of action. Its 21-year-old pilot, Second Lieutenant Charles L. Brown, was flying on adrenaline and instinct, barely conscious from the altitude and the cold pouring through the wreckage of his cockpit. Then a German fighter appeared alongside him. Oberleutnant Franz Steigler had just landed to rearm when he spotted the B-17 staggering northward at low altitude and climbed to intercept. Steigler was an experienced ace, 22 confirmed victories, 1 kill away from the Knight's Cross. He had every reason and every military obligation to finish the bomber. Under Luftwaffe regulations, failing to destroy a combat-capable enemy aircraft was a court-martial offense. Some interpretations went further than that. Steigler pulled close enough to see through the gaps in the aircraft's shattered fuselage. He saw the dead. He saw the wounded. He saw a crew that had nothing left to fight with. His commanding officer and mentor, Gustav Rödel, had once told him plainly, "You are a fighter pilot first, and an officer and a gentleman always." Shooting this crew, Steigler concluded, would be no different from shooting them in their parachutes. He flew alongside the B-17 instead. He escorted it northwest, across occupied territory, over the North Sea, until it was beyond the range of German anti-aircraft guns. Then he looked across at Brown, saluted, and flew away. Both men kept the encounter secret for decades. Brown because he feared no one would believe him. Steigler because what he had done could have meant his death if reported. They carried it alone across the entire Cold War until 1990, when Brown published an account in a veteran's newsletter and Stigler, living in Canada, saw it and made contact. The story of Stigler and Brown stands as the most documented, most human, and most complete act of mercy in the history of aerial combat. But what makes it the most impactful entry on this list is not what happened in the sky over Germany in December 1943. It is what happened after. Number 1. The enemy who flew him home. The two men met again in January 1990, 46 years after the morning over Bremen. Franz Stigler read Charles Brown's account in a veteran's newsletter and recognized the encounter immediately. The shattered nose, the low altitude, the crew he could see through the gaps in the fuselage, the salute he had given before turning for home. He wrote to Brown. Brown received the letter and, for a moment, could not speak. They had each believed, for nearly half a century, that the other was probably dead. What followed was a friendship that lasted until the end of both their lives. They met regularly. They corresponded. They told the story together, to historians, to schools, to veterans groups, to anyone who would listen. The full account was published in 2012 in the book A Higher Call, written by Adam Makos and Larry Alexander, drawn from both men's testimony and from military records on both sides. The facts hold up under scrutiny. The dates align. The aircraft match. The mission records confirm it. The encounter itself on December 20th, 1943, lasted perhaps 15 minutes from the moment Stigler pulled alongside to the moment he peeled away over the North Sea. Stigler had been one kill from one of the Luftwaffe's highest decorations. He flew away from it deliberately, knowing exactly what he was giving up, knowing that what he had seen through that shattered fuselage made the decoration beside the point. Brown landed Ye Old Pub at RAF Seething. Stigler returned to his base. Neither man filed a complete report of what had actually happened. The secret held for 46 years, kept alive in two separate silences on two sides of what became the Iron Curtain. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008. Charles Brown died on November 24, 2008. They let go 8 months apart in the same year at the end of two long lives that had almost been much shorter, connected by 15 minutes over the North Sea and 46 years of a friendship that the war had tried its hardest to make impossible. In a conflict that killed more than 70 million people, one pilot looked through the wreckage of an enemy aircraft, saw human beings instead of a target, and chose accordingly. That choice rippled forward across decades, producing a reunion, a friendship, and a story that outlived the war, the century, and both of the men who lived it. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.